like to mention that if you want to join the Free Software Foundation, you can do that with these cards here and now, or you can do it through fsf.org. And joining the Free Software Foundation is another way to support our work, just like buying the shirts or the pins or the key rings. And the last GNU that I have, I'm going to auction off at the end of the speech. So what is free software? Free software is software that respects the user's freedom. Our society encourages people to ignore that question. It teaches people to judge programs solely based on practical convenience and nothing else. So they ask, is this convenient? Is it reliable? Is it efficient? What does it cost? And they don't ask, if I use this program, how does it affect my freedom? If I use this program, what does it do to the social solidarity of my community? So those questions are what the free software movement is about. A free program is a program that respects the user's freedom. Non-free programs, proprietary programs, user subjugating programs, keep their users divided and helpless. Divided because they're forbidden to share the programs with anybody else. And helpless because the users don't have the source code, so they can't tell what the program, they can't change the program, and they can't even tell what it's really doing to them. And often it does something pretty nasty. So free software is software that respects the user's freedom. But that's a very general statement. Even Bush says that he's in favor of freedom, and Bush doesn't recognize freedom after he's crushed it. So I've got to say something more specific. Free software means that you, the user, have the 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and then change it to make the program do what you wish. Freedom 3 is the freedom to help your neighbor. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor, which is the freedom to make exact copies of the program and distribute them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community, which is the freedom to make and distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish. Now, each of these is literally a freedom. It's not an obligation. You don't have to do any of these things. The point is you should be free to do them if and when you wish. And distributing copies includes giving them away and includes selling them. You can do either one. So it's free as in freedom. It's not necessarily free as in 0 price. In any case, price is not the point. So think of free speech, not free beer, and you'll understand free software. So if a program gives you these 4 freedoms, that means that the social system of its distribution and use is an ethical system, one that respects the user's freedom and the social solidarity of her community. But if one of these freedoms is missing or insufficient, then the program is proprietary software, meaning that the social system of its distribution and use is an unethical system. So this is, whether a program is free software is not a technical question. It's not a question about what the code does. It's an ethical question. It's about how the developer treats the users. Does the developer try to subjugate them, or does the developer respect their freedom? So developing a free program is more or less a contribution to society. How much of a contribution depends on details, of course. But developing a proprietary program is not a contribution, it's an attack, it's a power grab. A proprietary program, in effect, is a trap. If it has any useful features, those are the bait for the trap. And if you fall into the trap, that means you have ceded your freedom. So the aim of the free software movement is to eliminate this social problem, which is proprietary software. We want all software to be free so that all users will be free. But why define free software this particular way? What makes these four freedoms essential? Each one has its reason. Freedom 2, the freedom to help your neighbor, the freedom to make and distribute exact copies when you wish, is essential on basic moral grounds. So you can live an ethical, upright life as a good member of your community. If you use a program which doesn't give you freedom 2, you are in danger of falling into a moral dilemma at any moment. Whenever your friend says, "That program is nice, could I have a copy?" In that moment, you will face a choice between two evils. One evil is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. The other evil is to deny your friend a copy and comply with the license of the program. If you are in a dilemma, you ought to choose the lesser evil, which is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. What makes this evil the lesser evil? Well, if you can't help doing wrong to somebody or other, it's better to do wrong to somebody who deserves it. Now, we can assume that your friend is a good friend and a good member of your community and normally deserves your cooperation. Not that that's the only possibility, but it's a perfectly real possibility. And it's good even to cooperate with people who haven't done you a lot of favors. You know, that's the way you promote cooperation and get it started. On the other hand, the developer of this proprietary program has deliberately attacked the social solidarity of your community. So, if you can't help doing wrong to one or the other, do it to the developer. But being the lesser evil does not make it good. It's never a good thing to make an agreement and then break it. Not even when the agreement is inherently evil, as this one is. When an agreement is inherently evil, keeping it is worse than breaking it. But still, breaking it is not good. And if you give your friend a copy, what will he have? He will have an unauthorized copy of a proprietary program, which is something pretty bad, almost as bad as an authorized copy would be. So, once you have fully understood this issue, what should you really do? You should make sure you never fall into this dilemma. I know of two ways. One is don't have any friends. That's the method implicitly suggested by the proprietary software developers. The other method is reject proprietary software. If you don't have a copy of this program, it can't pull you into the dilemma. That's my method. If someone offers me a program on the condition I promise not to share it with you, then no matter how useful or convenient it might be for me, I reject it. I will not accept a copy of that program. I tell the person offering me that treacherous deal, get out of here, take your nasty, evil program with you. And that's what you should do too. You should refuse to accept programs that require you to betray your community. And you should also reject the propaganda terms that the developers of proprietary software use to demonize cooperation and sharing. Terms like pirate. Because what do they mean when they use that term and apply it to people who share copies of things? They're trying to trick us into supposing without question that helping your neighbor is the moral equivalent of attacking a ship. And nothing could be more wrong than that. Because attacking ships is very bad, but helping your neighbor is good. So when people ask me what I think of piracy, I say attacking ships is very bad. And when they ask me what I think of software piracy or music piracy, I say, as far as I know, pirates don't use computers or attack by playing musical instruments badly. They use guns. Now, Bush might attack people by playing musical instruments badly. That's his sort of thing. In fact, there's even a movement of musicians against the use of their music to torture people. I wish it were just a joke. The torturers use it to keep someone from sleeping for days, and that is torture. In any case, don't accept the enemy's propaganda. Pirate is one example of a propaganda term. When they falsely label copyright infringement as theft, that's another propaganda term. Don't fall into it. Complain, criticize when someone makes that mistake. So freedom two, the freedom to help your neighbor, the freedom to redistribute exact copies of the program, is essential on basic moral grounds. Freedom zero, the freedom to run the program as you wish, is essential for a different reason, so you can control your computing. Now, there are proprietary programs that restrict the running of authorized copies. And that's obviously not having control over your computing. Leaving so soon? I hope it wasn't something I said. So, obviously, you should insist on freedom zero. You shouldn't let the developer make you agree to restrictions on how you can run the program. But freedom zero just means that you can either do or not do whatever the code of the program is already set up to do. So the developer still controls what you can or can't do, not through a license, but instead through the code of the program. So in order to control your computing, you also need freedom one, which is the freedom to study the source code and then change it to make the program do what you wish. This way you decide, instead of letting the developer impose his decisions on you. If you use a program without freedom one, you can't even tell what it's doing. And many of these programs do nasty things. For instance, some of them spy on the user. Some of them are designed to restrict the user and stop people from doing the things that they would naturally wish to do. And some are designed to attack the user, such as backdoors. One proprietary program you may have heard of that does all three is called Microsoft Windows. We know of features to spy on the user, more than one. We know of features designed to restrict the user. Digital restrictions management, this is known as DRM, or digital handcuffs. And we know it has features designed to attack the user, including a gaping backdoor. With Windows XP, if the upgrade facility is active at all, Microsoft can forcibly install changes in software without asking the user or telling the user. We don't know whether that's possible if the upgrade facility is entirely deactivated. We do know it's possible if the upgrade facility is active. Of course, but if this gives the user any way to defend against forced malicious upgrades, Microsoft eliminated it in Windows Vista. With Windows Vista, Microsoft can forcibly install any change, and there's nothing the user can do to prevent it. Now, these are gross examples of spying, but many, and restrictions and backdoors, but many other companies do these things too. For instance, Real Player spies on the user and reports whatever the user looks at. Apple has implemented malicious features to restrict the user. iTunes still has DRM in everything except music. And also a flagrant backdoor, just like the one in Windows Vista. Apple can forcibly change the software in Mac OS at any time. And this shows you the natural endpoint of proprietary software. It's a system of unjust power of the developer over the users. And those who have power tend to look for ways to use the power they have to get more. And that kind of total backdoor shows what happens when they succeed, namely they get total power. We don't know if that's the only backdoor. A few years ago in India, I was told that they had arrested some of the developers of Windows and accused them of working in parallel for Microsoft and Al-Qaeda, trying to put in another backdoor that Microsoft wasn't supposed to know about. That attempt apparently failed. Was there another that succeeded? We can't check. But we know that Microsoft itself installed a backdoor for the use of another terrorist organization, even more violent, namely the United States government. And this was found in 1999 in a piece of server software. So this should be enough to show you that you can't trust software without freedom one, at least not rationally. These programs are just trust me blindly software. They demand blind faith from the user because they deny the user any possibility of rationally checking. And many of them come from companies. It's not as if nobody ever abused this blind faith, right? If no one had ever heard of, no one had ever found malicious features, well, we might think that the system is invulnerable to them. But we know that many companies put malicious features into proprietary software, and anybody who continues to assume that it isn't malicious is a fool, which I hope that you're not. And the malicious features designed to restrict the users, well, that's the one kind that you'll notice, because when it stops you from doing something, you see that you can't do it. So those malicious features, at least we find out about, and that's why we know that lots of companies have put in such malicious features. And those are interesting because typically it's not just one company that sets up the scheme. It's done by a conspiracy of companies working together to restrict the public's access to technology. Consider, for instance, DVDs. Typically, the video on a DVD is written in an encrypted format, and the encryption algorithm and key were secret. They were kept secret in an attempt to make it impossible to independently make a DVD player. But then some people figured out the algorithm and the key and released free software that you could use to watch the video on a DVD, and which you could also use to copy the video on a DVD. And because of that, this program is now censored in the US because of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Since they didn't succeed in keeping it secret, they had to make it illegal to distribute such software. Now, in fact, people have been selling T-shirts with that algorithm on the shirt as a way of trying to show how outrageous this law is, essentially daring prosecute us for this shirt which denounces the law. But the DVD digital restrictions management system was not set up by one company. It was a conspiracy of companies because they said anybody that wants to make a DVD player has to join the conspiracy in order to get the secrets and get permission to make the DVD player. And part of what they had to promise when joining the conspiracy was that they would implement the same restrictions as all the other DVD players. That's why they all restrict people the same. It's not coincidence. It's not that they all independently decided to be nasty. It's that they all joined the conspiracy and they promised to restrict you. So you should never accept any product that was designed to restrict you unless you personally have the means necessary to break the handcuffs. So if you have the free software to watch the DVD, then it's okay to buy or rent DVDs or accept them as gifts. But otherwise, you should refuse. Because if you are willing to accept something that takes away your freedom, you're a patsy. And I hope you don't want to be one. But this kind of individual rejection is not enough. When we're facing a conspiracy, we need to organize too. So the Free Software Foundation has launched a campaign of protests against digital restrictions management. During the holiday selling season, we had people standing on streets handing out leaflets in front of some stores, urging people not to buy certain products. We need more, because what we need to do is show megacorporations that if they try to develop their products to attack your freedom, they will be hated. And they will be hated so much that it won't be good for them. Now, these conspiracies of businesses to restrict the public access to technology ought to be prosecuted as serious crimes. Conspiracies in restraint of trade is what they are. And this is much worse than price fixing, because price fixing only makes us pay more money, whereas this takes away our freedom. So this ought to be considered more serious. But as I'm sure you're aware, our government and most governments are not on our side. They're on the side of the megacorporations against us. You might wonder how I know about the DVD conspiracy and other such conspiracies. The answer is they don't keep it secret. That's how I know. They tend to have a website where they explain precisely how the conspiracy works and what you have to agree to if you join. And the reason is they know that the government's not going to prosecute these conspiracies to restrict our access to technology. They know that the government's on their side against us. So they have no fear of being prosecuted, and they're happy to tell everyone how they're conspiring to attack us. So for instance, since they're aware that the DVD encryption scheme is not a secret anymore, and they know that the free software is circulating even though it's censored, they developed a follow-on system called AACS, or the axe, because the axe is what we need to give it. And that has a website where you can find the rules that they demand manufacturers agree to. And they also say which companies were behind it, including Disney and Intel and Microsoft and Apple and Sony and others. So you can check for yourself that this is a conspiracy of corporations. And you can check for yourself that its goal is to restrict your access to technology. So if you want to participate in our campaign of protests, look at defectivebydesign.org. There you can sign up to be notified. Some of the protests are done physically, some are done through the net, so it's easy for you to participate from anywhere. Please join. We need big protests to teach the companies a lesson not to attack our freedom. So, without Freedom 1, you're always in danger of malicious features. But this is not to say that all of those developers put in malicious features. I only know about a few cases. The rest, we don't know. Right? In general, it's not easy to tell if there are malicious features in a program without Freedom 1. So we can divide those programs into two classes, the ones in which we know of some malicious features and the ones in which we don't. Now, I'm sure some of those programs have malicious features that others have not discovered, and others don't have malicious features, but we can't tell which is which. So if there are many of these programs that don't have malicious features, we can't identify one. But I can make a statement about all of them without identifying them. And that is, their developers are human. So they make mistakes. The code of those programs has bugs, because every program does. And the user of a program without Freedom 1 is just as helpless facing an accidental bug as facing an intentional malicious feature. If you use a program without Freedom 1, you are a prisoner of the program you use. Now, we, the developers of free software, are human too. So we also make mistakes, and our free software also has bugs. But if you find a bug in our code, or anything in our code that you don't like, you are free to change it, because we did not make you a prisoner. We can't be perfect. We can respect your freedom. So Freedom 1 is essential in order to control your computing. But Freedom 1 is not enough, because that's the freedom to personally study and change the source code. That's not enough, because there are millions of users that don't know how to program and thus are not able to personally directly exercise Freedom 1. But even for programmers like me, Freedom 1's not enough, because there is so much software in the world today. In fact, there's so much free software in the world today that no one person can possibly study all the software that she uses and master all the source code and then personally make all the changes that she might want, except in the case of somebody who never uses software, the trivial case. But other than that, this is more than one human being can do. So the only way we can fully take control of our computing is to do it working together, cooperating. And for that, we need Freedom 3, the freedom to contribute to your community, the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish. That makes it possible to cooperate, because if a few people release a free program and a lot of people use it because it does something useful, but they wish for some additional features, well, somebody can take that program and implement part of these features and release his modified version, and someone can start with that and add some more and release her modified version, and a few people can start with that and implement the rest and release their modified version, and then we'll have what we all wanted, and we'll say that those people all work together implementing these improvements. And thus, all users get the benefit of the 4 freedoms. Every user can directly exercise freedom 0 and freedom 2, the freedom to run the program as you wish and the freedom to distribute exact copies, because those don't require programming. If you know how to use the program, then you're in a position to exercise these 2 freedoms when you wish. Now, freedoms 1 and 3, the freedom to study and change the source code, and then optionally to distribute copies of your modified versions, those entail programming. So any given user is capable of exercising these freedoms more or less according to how much he knows how to program. Now, there are various levels of knowledge of programming. You can be a really good programmer, you could learn just a little, and then you could make easy changes only, or you might not learn any programming, and lots of people don't want to learn it. So they don't have to, but then they're not capable of directly exercising freedoms 1 and 3. But when other people who are programmers exercise these freedoms, and when they release their modified versions, then all of us can install them or not as we wish. So even without exercising these freedoms, we get the benefit of the fact that somebody else did. So we get the benefit of living in a society where people have these 4 freedoms, even without using them ourselves. And also, users can indirectly take advantage of these freedoms, even when they don't know how to exercise them directly. For instance, suppose that a user is using a free program and doesn't know how to program, but has some money. Suppose this user is a business, for instance, and it's, of course, most businesses are not software developers. They do lots of other things, but they tend to use computers and use software. Okay, so this business is using a program and would like it to be different. Suppose the people in the business conclude that their operations would be better if the program were changed. So it would be worth money to them to get it changed. Well, they can go see if somebody's willing to write that change in exchange for a part of that money. If anybody will do it for an appropriate price, then they have a deal. So then if they make this deal, then the user exercises freedom 2 to make an exact copy of the version that it uses and give that to the programmer. Then the programmer exercises his freedom 1 to study and change the source code to implement the changes that they agreed on, and then exercises his freedom 3 to give a copy of the improved version to the customer, the user. And assuming it works, the user then pays. So this is how a part of the free software business world works. And the user, in effect, since it doesn't know how to exercise freedoms 1 and 3 itself, pays someone else to exercise them for it. Thus, freedom 3 is also essential in order for us to fully have control of our computing, both collectively and individually at the same time. And what the 4 freedoms give us together is democracy. A free program develops democratically under the control of its users, because everybody is free to participate as much or as little as she wishes in society's decision about the future of the program, which is nothing other than the sum total of all the individual decisions people make about what to do with this program. And so the users collectively control its collective development, but then individually each one is free to change it or hire others to change it however that user may happen to wish. By contrast, a proprietary program develops under the dictatorship of its developer and functions as an instrument to impose that developer's power on all the users. So on one hand, we have individual freedom social solidarity, and democracy. On the other hand, we have the dictatorship of an autocrat who has unjust power over the users and employs it to mistreat them, bully them, and exploit them. Society should reject proprietary software and choose free software. And until society makes this choice, you should make this choice for yourself, just as I have done. And so the aim of the free software movement is the liberation of cyberspace and all its inhabitants. I arrived at these ideas, although not in their current form, in the early 80s. And in 1983, it was clear to me that I wanted to do something to make it possible to use a computer and have freedom. That was impossible in 1983. There was no way to buy a modern computer and run it and have freedom, because the computer won't run without an operating system, and all the operating systems for the modern computers at that time were proprietary. So you had to give up your freedom in order to get an operating system to make the machine do anything. So how could I change this? Well, I was not particularly famous, didn't have an army of people who agreed with me, and I had no political skills or experience. So it didn't seem that launching an ordinary sort of political movement was the way to do this. But I thought of another way, a way I could I could put an end to this social problem with technical work. I was an operating system developer. That was my field. And the problem existed, the worst part of the problem existed, because all the operating systems were proprietary. So all I would have to do is write another operating system, and then I, being the author, could make it free software, and then anybody would be able to use a computer and have freedom by using it with my system. Well, this meant that I was aware of an important social problem, a growing social problem, although at the time it only affected that narrow segment of society that used computers, a problem which most people didn't recognize as a problem. I had the skills necessary to try to correct this problem, and it looked like nobody else would do it if I did not. That meant that I had been elected by circumstances to do this work. It was my duty as a citizen. It's as if you see somebody drowning, and you know how to swim, and there's no one else around, and it's not Bush. Then you have a moral duty to save that person. Well, perhaps that statement is too strong. There may be other people of whom I should not claim you have a moral duty to save them, because Bush couldn't have done so much harm without the collaboration of lots of other people. But in any case, none of that affects me, since I don't know how to swim. But in this case, the job to be done was not swimming. It was writing an operating system, and that I did know how to do, or at least had a good chance, I thought. So I decided to develop a free software operating system, or die trying. Of old age, that is. Because at the time, the free software movement, which I was starting, had no active enemies. Lots of people thought it was ridiculous, but they didn't bother to oppose the movement. They just said that's silly and paid no more attention. So the obstacle was not opposition. It was a pile of programs that would have to be developed to have an entire operating system, assuming it was not going to be a toy like MS-DOS. So, and I meant a real operating system, not a toy. And that's a lot of work, and nobody knew if we'd ever be able to get it finished. A lot of people thought, well, it would be nice, but it's so big a job I give up. Well, I could have given up too, but that guaranteed failure. Whereas if I tried, we might succeed. So I decided to develop this free operating system. I decided to recruit others to help so that we'd get it done sooner. I decided to follow the design of Unix so it could be a portable system so that it would not become obsolete due to unforeseeable changes in the architectures of computers. And then I decided to make it upward compatible with Unix so that the many users of Unix would find it easy to switch. And then I gave it the name GNU, which stands for GNU's Not Unix. It's a recursive acronym. And in doing this, I followed a hacker tradition. You see, in the community of programmers that I was part of at MIT in the 1970s, we shared software, and that was our way of life. In fact, in the artificial intelligence lab, all the software we used was free until Xerox gave MIT that laser printer controlled by proprietary software you might have heard of. And so I experienced a way of life where we were working on advancing human knowledge, and we made our knowledge available to everyone. And we expected others to share with us in the same way. And in the 1970s, system programming generally was not portable. System programs were written in assembler language for one kind of machine. So it was quite commonly necessary to write another program similar to an existing program. That was the only way to make it possible to do the job on your computer. The other program might have been quite nice, it might have been available to you, but it wouldn't run on your machine, so you just had to write another. Well, in our community, in the community of those who call themselves hackers, we had a humorous custom to apply in these cases, and that was when you wrote a program similar to some existing program, you could give it a name which was a recursive acronym saying that your program is not the other one. It's a humorous way of giving credit. For instance, in 1976, I developed the first Emacs text editor, an extensible programmable text editor. And afterwards, there were around 30 imitations of Emacs. And some of them were called this or that Emacs, which was straightforward and obvious and not particularly funny. But there was also fine for fine is not Emacs, and there was sign for sign is not Emacs, and there was INA for INA is not Emacs, and there was mince for mince is not complete Emacs. And version 2 of INA was called zwei, for zwei was INA initially. So you can have a lot of fun with recursive acronyms. When I looked for a recursive acronym for something is not Unix, well, that would be blank INU. And when I looked at those combinations, none of them is a word, and without another meaning, it's not a joke. So what could I do? The only idea that occurred to me was to make a contraction and get rid of the I. I could have something's not Unix, blank NU. So I tried every initial. After all, I'm an engineer. So I tried ANU, BNU, KNU, DNU, ENU, FNU, GNU. Well, GNU, of course, is the funniest word in the English language, or at least the most humor-charged word in the English language, because according to the dictionary, the G is silent. So the word is used in lots of wordplay. Every time you want to write the word new, you can spell it GNU and you've got a joke. Maybe not a very good joke, but there are lots of them. So the word GNU is permanently linked with humor. So given a specific, meaningful reason to use it as the name of some programming project, I couldn't resist. But when it's the name of our operating system, please do not follow the dictionary. If you call it the new operating system, you'll get people confused. It was new once, but we've been working on it for 25 years now. And we've been using a variant of it for almost 17 years. So it's not new anymore. But it still is GNU. And it always will be GNU, no matter how many people mispronounce it Linux. But how did such a strange error get started? Just basically a few people were confused and others imitated them. Here's what happened. During the 80s, our task in the GNU project was to develop these hundreds of components we would need for the GNU operating system. By 1990, we had most of them, but there was one major essential component that was missing, and that was the kernel, which is the program that allocates the computer's resources to all the other programs that run. So in 1990, I found out about a microkernel which was about to be released as free software. And so I decided that we would develop a kernel using that microkernel as the base. So we would only have to write the top half. So I thought this way, we'd only have to write part of it, it'll take us less time. And not only that, those programs would run in user space, so we could debug them with an ordinary source code debugger. And that would also speed development, I hoped. So the Free Software Foundation hired somebody to implement this idea. I don't know all the things that went wrong because I didn't work on it myself, but it took many years to get our kernel to run at all, and it still doesn't work very well. So we don't recommend that people use it unless they want to work on developing it. And that's being done by a few volunteers and is not going very fast. The reason we don't focus on it now is that there are other free kernels. And in particular, a Finnish college student in 1991 wrote a kernel using the usual monolithic design, and he got it to barely work in less than 1 year. That kernel is called Linux. And when he first released it in 1991, it was not free software because its license had an unacceptable restriction. It prohibited commercial distribution. Now, in order for a program to be free software, any kind of user has to be able to have the 4 freedoms and use them in all sorts of activities in life. So if redistribution is not allowed for businesses, the program's not free. However, in 1992, Torvalds changed the license of Linux. He re-released it under the GNU General Public License, which is one of the free software licenses. It's not the only one, there are many. But the GNU GPL is the one most commonly used. About 70% of free software packages use the GNU GPL, and about 30% use other licenses. Now, the reason free software needs to have a license is that according to today's copyright law, every program that's written is automatically and immediately copyrighted. And copyright law, by default, prohibits people from copying it, distributing copies, modifying it, and in many countries even restricts them from running it. So the only way to make a program free software is for the copyright holder to attach an explicit declaration giving the users the 4 freedoms. And if the license gives the users the 4 freedoms, then it qualifies as a free software license. That's why the GNU GPL is not the only one, because there are many ways to write a license which will give people the 4 freedoms. And such a license qualifies. But some of these free software licenses are better than others. What makes the GNU GPL special, and the reason why so many people use it, is it's a copyleft license. Now, copyleft is a legal technique that I developed because I wanted not just to respect other people's freedom myself, as I'm morally bound to do. I wanted to go further and defend the freedom of all the users against middlemen who might try to take it away, because I'd already seen this happen. Person A releases a free program under a license that allows B to redistribute it as proprietary software, or perhaps allows B to make some changes and distribute his version as proprietary software. And the result is lots of other people potentially get a version of A's free program, but they don't get freedom. Well, I wanted to make sure that if person A was me, that all the users would really get the 4 freedoms, which meant I had to find a way to stop B, the middleman, from taking those freedoms away. The technique I came up with is the technique we call copyleft. The license says when you redistribute this, you have to redistribute this under this license. You can't add restrictions, and not only that, you can't remove these requirements because that would allow someone else to add restrictions later. And also, you must provide the source code. You must provide a copy of the license, etc. So essentially, the license says you must propagate the freedom. Whenever you distribute this or any modified version of this program, you must pass along to others the same freedom that you got from us. So there are many people in this scenario. If you're the end user, what this does is it guarantees you will get the same freedom that the original author put on. If you're a middleman, what it says is there are some requirements you have to satisfy. Namely, you can't strip off the freedom and pass the code along to other people without the freedom. That's the means that assures all the users ultimately do get the freedom. So once Linux was available under the GNU GPL, it was free software. And thus the combination of the GNU system, which was incomplete, but most of it was there, and the kernel Linux made a complete free operating system. And for the first time, it was possible to go and buy a PC and install a free operating system and run it in freedom. Thus, the liberation of Linux in 1992 was a major contribution to the free software community. Before that, we had lots of useful pieces of the GNU system, which you could run on top of some other system. But that other system had to be proprietary because that's all there was. Once the last missing piece was added, it was possible to install this system, although at that stage it wasn't easy, but it was possible to install the system into an empty computer and not have proprietary software. And thus the goal that I had announced in 1983 had been achieved in 1992. But the people who combined the incomplete GNU system and Linux were not us, because we still thought our kernel will be running soon, and it'll be much better. So other people put those two things together, and they mistakenly called the whole system Linux, in effect giving the credit for the whole thing to Mr. Torvalds, who'd written one piece, which is not really fair to us. And then other people imitated them, and that's how it happens that millions or tens of millions of people are running this variant of the GNU system, and they don't know it's a variant of the GNU system. They think it was all done by Mr. Torvalds, and that its development was begun in 1992. And of course, that's not nice. So please, when you talk about the system, please don't call it Linux. Please call it GNU/Linux or GNU plus Linux, and give us equal mention. We did, after all, start the whole thing. We did, after all, write a much larger part of the system ourselves, and we supplied the vision for what was ultimately produced. So it seems fair to give us equal mention. But it's true that just giving people credit is not the most important ethical issue in life. And if it were just an issue of that, it wouldn't deserve a big fuss. But there's something else much more important at stake in this question of names, and that is your freedom. Not directly, of course, because directly what name you choose doesn't change much of anything. But indirectly it has influence. You see, the name GNU, since 1983, when I announced it, has been associated with these ideas of freedom. And the name Linux has not been. The name Linux is associated with very different ideas, the ideas of Mr. Torvalds. And he has never agreed with these ideals of the free software movement. He thinks they're ridiculous, and he says so. Well, he has a right to his views. But what happens if you call the whole system Linux and give him the credit for our work is that you lead other people to think that he started it all and that it all comes out of his vision of life. So you're leading the users to, if they like the system, to follow his vision of life. And if they do, where is he going to lead them? He's not going to lead them to value their freedom or defend their freedom. And if they don't defend their freedom, well, basically we're all in it together. We either win or we don't. So if they're not interested in their own freedom and they don't help defend it, we're more likely to lose it. Because freedom is frequently threatened. And if you aren't prepared to defend it, you're very likely to lose it. Bush showed us how easy it is to lose your freedom if you ever make the mistake of thinking that something else is more important. And I'm afraid Obama is going to show us how hard it is to win back that freedom once you've lost it. Because I think we're still going to have to struggle to get it back. Now, people have been debating ideas of human rights for centuries. Plenty of time to reach conclusions about what human rights people deserve and then spread these ideas around the world. That doesn't always mean we succeed in defending human rights, but at least it gives us a chance to try. A base from which to try. But computing is a new area of life. Didn't exist at all 60 years ago, basically. And even 20 years ago, only a small fraction of people in the US had ever used a computer. It was an unusual thing that was done by a small segment of society. So that's, of course, subsequently, most people in the US began using computers, but it hasn't been very long. 15 years isn't a long time to have a debate about what human rights you are entitled to because you're using a program. Even if society were to try to have this debate. But for the most part, there has been no debate. You see, most computer users started using computers with proprietary software, surrounded by other users of proprietary software. And they didn't know there was any other way things could be. So they didn't question it. They took for granted that proprietary software is legitimate. And they let the proprietary software developers dictate the answer to the question, what human rights are you entitled to as the user of a program? And the answer they chose was essentially none at all. We in the free software movement disagree. We dispute their conclusion. We say we've identified 4 human rights that you deserve as the user of a program, namely the 4 freedoms that define free software. But when we try to make it a social debate about this, we have to overcome 2 big obstacles. One, that people don't know that the system they're using is GNU. They think it's Linux, and they don't know that it was developed for their freedom. So when they may talk about our work for days or weeks and never once think of the ideals of freedom for which we developed it. And second, they often haven't even heard of the free software movement, because the people who agree with Torvalds don't call it free software. They have a different term, open source, which stands for different ideas. Now, if you look at them as just criteria for software licenses, well, what you see is we have a definition, and open source has another definition, which is a bit bigger. So there are a few licenses which qualify as open source, but they don't qualify as free software licenses. However, there are not many programs released that way. So if a program is open source, it's almost always free software. So if you're just looking at which programs qualify, the difference is non-zero, but it's small. May not be a big issue. But when you look at the level of philosophical values, the ideas of free software and the ideas of open source are totally different. Open source supporters would hardly say any of the things I've told you today. They disagree, or they don't want to talk about it. The term open source was coined in 1998. During the mid-90s, as the GNU plus Linux system was catching on, there was a dispute within the free software community between those of us who valued freedom and those who didn't care about freedom or any kind of ideals, but just wanted powerful, reliable, convenient software that they could play with. And then in 1998, the second group adopted the term open source as a way of getting away from everything we had said. And the companies that were involved with free software mostly switched rather quickly to the term open source because they were very happy never to raise the ethical issue of whether non-free software was legitimate at all. Because most of them were involved in some way or other with non-free software, and they didn't like the fact that we were saying that non-free software is unethical. So by using a new term, they got to choose which ideas to associate with it. And they chose to leave out the ethical level entirely. So the open source people, they recommend letting people copy and change the software, but they don't say that it's an ethical imperative to respect this. They don't criticize non-open source software on ethical grounds. They only argue that it's a preference. And so they don't try to raise the debate about what rights you deserve as the user of a program. And today, for us to bring our ideas to the users of our software, we have to overcome these two obstacles. That's why if you care about freedom, it's important for you to help reduce those obstacles. So don't talk about open source, talk about free software, if you would like people to think about the ideas of free software. And please don't call our operating system Linux. That also, by calling it GNU/Linux, you will help make the users aware where the system really comes from and why. And that way, when they see an article from the GNU project that explains the issues of freedom, which are why we developed the system, they will recognize that there's a reason they should pay attention. If they know they're using the GNU system, they will see a reason to pay attention. They'll say, ah, this is why the GNU system exists. I like the GNU system. The reasons for it should matter to me. But if they think that the system is Linux, they're likely to look at this article about the philosophy of GNU and say, that has nothing to do with me. I'm a Linux user. Why should I pay attention to the ideas of GNU? It's ironic. If only they understood the facts, they would know why, but they don't know the facts. The misleading name gives people the wrong idea about the facts. Now, why do we need to be concerned with this? Is it just a theoretical concern that we might lose our freedom? No. In fact, it's happened in our community several times that we've lost freedom in certain areas or weakened ourselves because our community didn't care enough to defend itself. For instance, in 1992, there was the combination of GNU and Linux, which was entirely free software. By 1995, there were several distributions of the GNU/Linux system, maintained and developed by different groups of people. And mostly, they didn't care about freedom. And they were competing with each other. So one group thought that they could get an advantage if they added some proprietary programs to their distribution. And they presented this to the public as a bonus, as an advantage of their distribution. So what message were they spreading by calling proprietary programs a bonus? Well, the exact opposite of the ideas of the free software movement. But most of the users hadn't heard about these ideas either, so they just ate it up. And the developers of other distros looked at that and said, uh-oh, they've got a big advantage because they added these non-free programs. We better add these non-free programs too so we won't be at a disadvantage. So they did that. And over the years, all the distributions added non-free software. Or by the end of the 90s, when people asked me, where can I get a copy of this system? I had to say, I'm sorry, I don't know any place I can recommend because all the distributions include non-free programs and my conscience won't allow me to recommend them. I can't steer you towards them. Well, I'm happy to say that today there are completely free distributions of GNU/Linux, which don't reject our ideals by steering the user towards non-free programs. They include Ututo, UTUTO, and BLAG, which stands for BLAG, Linux, and GNU. And GNUsense, which is spelled GNUsense, which is also a joke because my title as the head of the GNU project is the Chief GNUsense, spelled G followed by nuisance. So these distributions have the policy that they delete any non-free software they might find in their distributions. But these are not the distributions that people have mostly heard of. The well-known distributions we can't recommend because they continue to include or install or steer people towards non-free software. So we look at this particular level, we completely lost our freedom, and then we've begun to recover it, but just begun. And then it happened again. See, in the early 90s, the only way that the GNU/Linux system could work with a certain I/O device, with whatever I/O device was, if somebody wrote a free driver for the device. And that would put a lot of pressure on the community to work on free drivers, And it also meant that we wouldn't get the devices that didn't have free drivers. So although we weren't so many back then, we had to apply our market force against the companies that wouldn't cooperate. But then Torvalds added a feature that was convenient, but it gave us a foolish, easy way out to those of us who didn't have principles against it. Namely, he implemented a feature in Linux, the kernel, for dynamic loading of device drivers. Now, the effect of this was that GNU/Linux could use a device with a proprietary driver by dynamically loading it. Now, I think that this violates the GNU GPL just as much as statically linking the same driver would violate the GNU GPL. But the developers of Linux didn't enforce their copyright in that way, and non-free drivers became quite common. Now, for the many users who didn't think about freedom as an issue, they just looked for the proprietary drivers and used them, and they thought of this as a solution. For those of us who want freedom, however, it's not a solution, which means it's the problem. It's another part of the problem. So we still try to do things like reverse engineer and figure out how to control the device and write a free driver. We still refuse to buy those products. But most of the community doesn't join us in doing these things, and since we're few, it's harder, the battle is harder. Now, we are nonetheless making some progress. Things are better now than they were a few years ago. But it's hard going. It would, if only all the users of GNU/Linux refused to buy the devices that won't work with free drivers, we would win very easily. There's something like 100 million of us. We have enough market power that we would convince a lot of companies to cooperate with us very easily if only we used our market power. But because most of the people in our community don't think about these issues, they don't use their market power. And as a result, we're not so strong, and the battle continues. So, for instance, you should never get a machine with an NVIDIA's graphics accelerator. That's the only company that refuses to cooperate. So make sure the machine you're going to get does not have NVIDIA's video chips. To make it easier for people to use their market power, the Free Software Foundation has the hardware resource pages. You look at fsf.org and then look at resources, you'll find these. For various categories of hardware products, we've listed the ones that work with entirely free software. And we're also, of course, looking for information to update these pages. We'd like to list more products and fill in the categories we don't have. And then, a few years later, I found out about another problem that had developed in the same way. In fact, nowadays, Torvalds' version of Linux is not free software. Because several years ago, he started accepting pieces of code which are not free. These pieces of code are called firmware. They don't run in the CPU. They run in some other processor somewhere in the machine. But they're not hidden away inside a device where you'd never see it. And the reason that they're in Linux is that when Linux starts to use the device, it has to load this firmware into the device, which means you are installing software there. And you've got a copy of this non-free program installed in your machine. So we can't ignore it. Now, not only does it mean that the source code of Linux is no longer free, it's not even source code. most of these pieces of firmware are not available as source code. They're just binaries. So you'll be looking at a file of supposedly C source code, and you'll come to, say, a table of 30,000 numbers. And those 30,000 numbers are actually an executable program dressed up as an initializer. Well, this is not source code, and it violates the GPL. The GPL has a general and clear definition of source code. It's the preferred form of the program for making changes in, and that is not a list of numbers. So, actually, this is a violation of the GPL to include those, but what can you do? The developers don't enforce this, and we can't make them. But nonetheless, it's not free software. So nowadays, we maintain a modified version of Linux for use in free GNU/Linux distributions. It's called Linux Libre, and what we do is we delete these blobs. It's not actually a fork. It's a modified version, and we modify each new release. To actually fork it would be causing unnecessary difficulties. But the point is, it's very easy for people to lose their freedom and lose your freedom if you're depending on them to protect it when they don't care about freedom. Why doesn't Linux move to version 3 of the GPL? It's because version 3 protects the user's freedom against a new method of taking it away, namely TiVoization. TiVoization, which is named after a product of TiVo which does this, is the practice of designing the hardware so that if the user installs modified versions of the software, the device won't run. So the TiVo contains a small GNU/Linux system, and initially the manufacturer failed to comply with GPL version 2 and didn't give users the source code. So we told them that this was illegal, and so they started providing source code, but they started building the device so if the user installed modified versions of these programs, it wouldn't run. So theoretically speaking, the user has freedom 1, the freedom to study and change the source code. He just can't use the results. So GPL version 3 protects freedom 1 in practical terms, not just theoretically, by saying that whoever is distributing this kind of product has to give the users whatever information is needed in order to install their modified binaries and have them actually run. This is what Torvalds doesn't want. He doesn't want the user's freedom to be protected, and he says that he's against protecting users' freedom. In his words, so how are we going to protect our freedom? How are we going to convince other people to join us so that we can all together defend our freedom? The most important thing to do is to teach more people to think about the issue of freedom, because our future depends above all on what we value. So we need to think about our actions. Do we engage in actions which imply that freedom is not important? Because our actions speak louder than our words. And not only that, those who engage in these actions probably won't use any words to support freedom either. They usually talk about open source. So they end up not supporting freedom either with words or actions. we've got to think about our words and think about our actions too, to make sure we're acting in a way that shows we really mean business, that we're really serious when we talk about freedom. That's why I won't recommend the GNU/Linux distributions that steer users toward non-free software. If I did, in effect, I'd be saying, when I talk about freedom, that's just words, I don't really care. I don't really think that's important. If you want to defend freedom, you need to make this effort too. We can't win without your help. Now, to close, I'd like to cover a few side topics. One of them is free software and employment. If the world's computer users move to free software, how will this affect employment in the IT sector? Not much. If this is the IT sector, well, paid programming is just a small fraction of that. And in the paid programming, development of proprietary software is a small fraction of that. Most of it is development of custom software, where the developers are writing a program which one particular client is paying for and is going to use. If all the software were free, it wouldn't have much effect on the custom software business, because the client who wants a particular specialized program developed this year is going to have to pay anyway. Sure, if it's free, if it's a matter of adapting some free software, volunteers might do it, but they won't, because they're not interested in doing some specialized thing for a company to use. The people who are capable of doing that, they might spend a lot of time working on general purpose improvements for the community as volunteers, but when a company asks them to write something specifically for the company, they're most likely to say, sure, I could do that, but you'd have to pay me, because I'm not really interested in that. And that's an opportunity for me to make some money, and why shouldn't I? So this business is not going to change, not much, and this part's not affected. So it's just a small fraction of the IT sector that would disappear. Nothing to be afraid of. But this doesn't mean that the total employment would be less. It might be more, because free software also generates employment. Employment adapting and extending free software. Now, to adapt and extend a proprietary program is usually impossible, because you can't get the source code, which means the potential clients don't even think about whether they want to pay somebody to do it. But when it's free software, this is a real option, and clients do pay people to do this. So we lose a small part and we gain something, and I'm not an economist, I can't try to estimate which is bigger, but it's clear that there's no danger of substantial job losses from this. So there's nothing to be afraid of. Another relevant side issue is free software and education. Schools must teach only free software. It's an ethical imperative. If you are carrying a portable tracking and surveillance device, please switch it off. They've already tracked you here, and besides, it'll still emit tracking signals occasionally, even if you switch it off. And if they want to listen to my speech, they don't have to do it by turning on your phone to listen without ringing, which they could do. They'd be welcome to come to the speech anyway. So there are 4 reasons why schools should use only free software in their education. The most obvious one is to save money. Even in the wealthiest countries, the schools don't have enough money, they're limited by their budgets, so they shouldn't spend some of their money paying for permission to run proprietary programs. This reason is superficial, and even people who don't understand what free software really means can understand this reason. But some proprietary software companies eliminate this reason by handing out gratis copies of their non-free programs to schools. And why do they do this? When we think about why, we'll see the second reason. The reason they do this is they're hoping to use the schools as instruments to impose on society a dependence on their proprietary products. And here's how it works. They give the gratis copies to the school teaches the students to use it, and they develop a dependence. And then they graduate, and they still have the dependence, but after they graduate, the same company will not offer them gratis copies of these products. And they also go to work for companies after they graduate. Well, the developer is not going to offer those companies gratis copies of these products either. So in effect, the school directs its students down the path of permanent dependence, and the students then pull all the rest of society with them. That's the evil plan. But schools should refuse to participate. Schools should be no more willing to do this than they would be willing to accept addictive drugs to inject into their students to make them develop a dependence. Of course, they offer the first dose gratis. After you have the dependency, then you have to pay. So schools should reject this because schools have a social mission to educate the next generation as good citizens of a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society. And when it comes to computing, that means teaching people to use free software, teaching people how to live as citizens in that society. But there's another deeper reason. For the sake of the education of the best programmers. You see, some people are natural-born programmers, and at the age of 13 or more or less, they're fascinated with computers and they want to learn everything about how the system works. So if they use a program, they want to know, how does it do this? But if the program is proprietary, when our kid asks the teacher, how does this program work, the teacher can only respond, I'm sorry, I don't know, and you can't find out because it's a secret. And thus, there is no room for education. Proprietary software is the enemy of the spirit of education. But if the program is free, the teacher can explain as much as he knows and then say, here's a copy of the source code of this program, read it, and you'll understand everything. And that kid will read it because he's fascinated and he yearns to understand everything. And the teacher can say, if you come across anything that you can't figure out on your own, show it to me and we'll figure it out together. And this gives our natural-born programmer the chance to learn something very important. That code is not clear, so don't write it that way. If even he can't figure it out, it must be very unclear. Now, you don't have to teach these kids to program. They read a manual and they say, oh, programming is that. What else could it be? But learning to program well is a different story. The way you learn to program well is by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. And the way you learn to write the code for a large program is by writing small changes to a large program. You can't learn this by writing small programs, because small programs don't even begin to expose you to the complications of large programs. So you have to start small, but you have to do it in a large program, which means you have to take an existing large program and add to it. Only free software gives you the opportunity to do these things. I had the opportunity to do this working at MIT in a free software community where we shared software. It was our way of life. That was a rare opportunity. Today, any school can give this opportunity, but only if it's a free software school. However, there is an even deeper reason. For the sake of moral education, education in citizenship, schools must teach not just facts and skills, but also the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping your neighbor. So every class should have this rule. Students, if you bring a program to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the students in the class. But the school has to practice its own rule in order to set a good example. So the teacher also must share software with the students in the class. They have to be free to take home copies of the executable and the source code and learn from it, because the classroom is a place for education, not a place for keeping the useful knowledge secret. All schools should move entirely to free software, and that includes this one. So those of you who are connected with this school or any school, it's up to you to campaign for that school to move to free software. I've visited universities which have moved entirely to free software. I've visited parts of the world where the public schools are using only free software. It can be done. It just requires the will. So for more information, you can take a look at GNU.org and FSF.org. You can also, through FSF.org, become a member of the Free Software Foundation. If you want to do that with cash today, you can fill out one of these cards and give me the money, and I'll send this in. So now I will close by presenting my other identity. Oh, and by the way, those of you who would like to tell the FSF how to reach you, you can do it by filling out one of these cards and handing it back. I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as a text editor, an extensible text editor, and then became a way of life for many users because it had been extended so much that they could do all their work without ever exiting Emacs. And then it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs. Today in the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between several rival versions of Emacs. And we also have saints, but fortunately no gods. Instead of gods, we worship an editor. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, that is, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. And then at some point, when you feel that you have become a real hacker, you can have a FUBAR mitzvah. In which, as a as a new hacker, you stand in front of other hackers and chant beautiful parts of the system's source code. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs. The Virgin of Emacs is any woman who has not yet learned to use Emacs. And taking away her Emacs virginity is considered a blessed act in the Church of Emacs. Now, the Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with other churches that I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So if you have been searching for a church to be saintly in, you might want to consider ours. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise any proprietary operating systems that have possessed any of the computers under your control or set up for your use. And then you must install a wholly free operating system, where holy can be spelled in multiple ways, and then only install free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint, and you too will have the right to wear a halo if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. Sometimes people ask me whether it is a sin in the Church of Emacs to use the other editor, VI. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. And sometimes people ask me whether my Halo was really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So thank you very much. So now it's time for the auction. I've got one more GNU, and so I'd like to auction it for the Free Software Foundation. And so I will start at $20. Do I get an offer of $20 for this GNU? I got 20. Do I get 25? Do I get 25? A question? Well, remember, it's free as in free speech, not as in free beer. We don't have it. So do I get 25? Anyone bid $25? I've got 25. Do I get 30? I've got 30. Do I get 35? Do I get 35? Anyone bid 35? I've got 35. Do I get 40? I've got 40. Do I get 45? Do I get 45? I've got 40. Do I get 45? Does anyone bid $45 to the Free Software Foundation to defend your freedom? Please speak up if you bid. Do I get 45? I've got 45. Do I get 50? I've got 50. I've got 50. Do I get 55? Do I hear 55? I've got 50. Do I get 55? 55 anywhere? Do I get $55 to the Free Software Foundation for this GNU? The GNU is adorable and needs a home. And not only that, you'll be helping the FSF staff defend your freedom. I've got 50. Do I get 55? Last chance. Going. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Actually, it's amazing how often people in these auctions overbid themselves. So now it's time for questions. I am somewhat hard of hearing, so please speak loud and slowly and pronounce your consonants carefully. Go to the microphones. There are 2 microphones here. I'm not going to pick people. Just go to the microphones and line up. And I'll just alternate between the microphones. By waiting online, you assure that it will be fair. When it comes to be your turn, you'll get to ask. So you were there, so yeah, it's working. Speak.
Yeah. With regard to the freedom
please move your mouth a bit further away from the microphone.
With regard to the freedom to copy and distribute the software, would you apply the same principle to books, and if not, why not?
Well, there are different kinds of books. Some of them are works that you use to do a practical job. For instance, textbooks and reference works and cookbooks. You know, I think those should be free. So I do apply the same idea to those, but other books express opinions like this one. And I don't think that statements of opinion have to permit publication of modified versions. And so that changes the issue. So, and likewise for art, I don't think it's an ethical obligation to permit modified versions, at least not for a reasonable time, like 10 years. And so for the works that are not works of practical use, my position is that everybody should be free to non-commercially share exact copies, but other things can still be covered by copyright for a reasonable period of time.
Hi, how do you feel about processor microcode? Usually it's encrypted.
Sorry, how do I feel about what?
Processor microcode, like for Intel, that's usually encrypted.
I think it's okay. Okay, if a program is buried inside some device and you don't have to know it's there at all, then it doesn't really make a difference whether it's a program or a circuit. And I think it would be foolish to make a fuss about the program, given it might as well have been a circuit, and then you obviously wouldn't be able to copy or change it anyway. So, of course, there's an area where the line has to go, which is hard to draw the line in, and maybe at some point we have to say it really doesn't matter whether the line is here or here or here.
Just a quick follow-up in terms of freedom and security, and for example, you have microcode updates for all kinds of problems that have like critical security implications. Problems.
If people start installing microcode updates, then it's got to be free software. So basically, you can either treat it as part of the hardware, which means you don't install updates for it, or you can treat it as software, in which case it better be free.
In a capitalist society, if you're good at something and people are willing to pay you for it, you do it and then you receive payment.
No, actually you're mistaken.
Okay.
Factually speaking, that's not true. In a capitalist society, there are many things which many people do and do it to get paid for.
Very true.
But it's not the case that everybody does everything to get paid for.
Yes, that is also true. Although if you're good, particularly good at something and people are willing to pay for it, you would love to do it.
That depends what it is, and depends whether it's unethical.
Well, here's my question. I'm sorry for the bad intro. Basically, you're trying to increase freedom by allowing for, I remember your business model, you mentioned that people would pay for updates.
Well, I mentioned the fact that some people pay for changes, pay a programmer to change a free program, which is not exactly updates.
I apologize, I misspoke again. But I particularly remember a specific part of your speech in that the free software, the age in which it's all free software, people would pay for changes to be made. And in this particular case, which I thought about that and I really liked it, but are you not taking away freedoms in two particular instances? Let's say that this person who has paid for this particular program wants to give it away to someone else.
Sure he can, because it's free software.
Great. But then the programmer has his freedom taken away.
No, he doesn't. What he has is power taken away. You're confusing freedom with power. Freedom is control of your own life. Power is controlling someone else's life. So what that programmer doesn't get, although in this scenario he would never expect to get it, so he wouldn't be disappointed. He wouldn't have known all along that he wasn't going to get this power. But the power he's not going to get is the power to forbid other people from cooperating without him. But he shouldn't have that power. That power is unjust. And that's the reason for all of this, to prevent anyone from having that power. And that's the reason why I decided I had to make my software free, because to exercise that kind of power over other people is mistreating them. The first ethical link in all of this is the idea that I must not mistreat other people when I develop software.
Thank you.
Just a follow-up comment before I actually ask my question. The gentleman who introduced the book that you're trying to sell, Lawrence Lessig, made the point that restricting one's freedoms are not necessarily just, but is justifiable in the respect that because you are restricting people's freedom to copy material that was never copyable before, creative content, ensures the ability for artists to continue to produce material.
Well, actually, I have a number of points of disagreement with that. He may have said that. I don't entirely agree with him, with his views on these issues. First of all, I don't want to call works content. That term disparages them by implying that they're only important to fill up a box. So I'd rather call them creative works. I refuse to ever call them content. But in any case, that's a matter of terminology. I think it's important, but of course your point has substance.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm going to respond now to the substance of what you said. I'm in favor, it's a mistake to think that today's copyright system actually enables artists to make a living, because it does for a few, but for most it doesn't really work. It's a very bad system. It's very important for us to realize when we think about whatever we might lose if we didn't have this system, we shouldn't exaggerate how well it works. There's a tendency to treat it as if it were really great when rejecting any proposal to change it. And it's really lousy. We need to know that. Finally, I'm in favor of promoting the arts, but that doesn't make it, but not at the price of any important freedom. The copyright system was designed in the age of the printing press, and it was designed so as not to take away any important freedom from readers. And that's what made it okay. But now it does take away important freedoms from readers, and that makes it unacceptable, at least the way it is. I'm not saying we should abolish copyright.
Which freedoms, please?
Well, the minimum freedom for all kinds of works is the freedom to non-commercially share exact copies of the work. To take away that freedom is outrageous, and it can only be enforced with draconian laws, which can't be justified.
May I ask my question?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm particularly interested in freedom too because it hits home for me. My uncle, very close member of my family, is engaged in the business of making royalty-free music. Now, as it stands, the concept of freedom too allows other people to copy his royalty-free music and therefore puts him out of a job. Now,
I'm afraid I don't understand. Royalty-free music.
Yes.
I thought that when I hear that term, it sounds like it says he's letting everyone copy it.
No, he's not.
Then I don't understand
No,
what
the
you're talking
concept
about.
of royalty-free music is that the artist allows producers of other content to buy the music at a flat price and not pay royalties for its production in other content such as movies and
Well, I'm
videos.
afraid okay, well, you're talking about modified uses or uses combined into other works, which is not just sharing exact copies of the work itself. So in fact, what I'm saying, it sounds like would have no effect on his business model.
If given the opportunity to copy that material out of another work under under Freedom 3.
Sorry, copying something out of a work is talking about modifying it, not just copying the whole work.
I'm sorry, how will my uncle feed his 8-year-old
You don't know
daughter?
what you don't even understand what I'm saying. The same way he does now. What I'm trying to tell you and what you're not getting is that you've misunderstood what I said and that it doesn't have the effect you think it has.
Clarify.
How much time do I have to give you? I think I made it clear to everyone else. Maybe one of them will explain it to you.
If you sell one copy,
You don't. He's talking. You maybe didn't understand what he's saying. He's saying that he sells the rights to use his music as part of other works, not just to distribute and listen to his music by itself. Well, the thing that he sells is something that is not part of this minimum necessary freedom. So what I'm proposing wouldn't change any of that. I'm talking about that. I'm saying that everyone should have the freedom to non-commercially redistribute exact copies of a published work. But what he sells is permission to do something else, which isn't part of that. Think about it some more, you'll get it.
Hi. You were talking before earlier about DVDs, and you implied that if you received a DVD as a gift and the DECSS or whatever software wasn't available for you to use, you didn't have a way of playing with free software, that you would refuse the gift.
I would. I have done so.
On the basis of the software not being free, or that the medium, the DVD itself, is locked down?
I would. Basically, I have refused such gifts. And I do it because these devices are meant to attack our freedom. And that makes them extremely evil.
I'm just trying to extend that analogy, and maybe the analogy is bad, but so I want to see why. I mean, when you go into a movie theater, you're generally prohibited from taping, videotaping the movie. In that way,
It doesn't
isn't the
seem
movie theater
similar
locked
to
down?
me. I mean, it just doesn't seem like a good analogy. I think you're trying too hard to generalize. Now, this is a typical pattern among techies to take any idea and try to stretch it as far as possible, try to ignore as many as possible of the circumstances. And I don't think that's a useful way to think in ethics. I think that all these different situations need to be looked at separately.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, it's your turn.
You've given us your thoughts on the GNU Linux operating system and its common usage. What are your thoughts on other operating systems, like purportedly free operating systems like NetBSD, FreeBSD?
Well, BSD basically is a free operating system in the same way that GNU/Linux basically is a free operating system, but any given distro may not be entirely free. Now, only a tiny fraction of the GNU/Linux distros are entirely free, and the fraction of BSD distros which are entirely free is approximately the same. It's 0. There are no entirely free distros of BSD. I wish there were.
Thank you.
So my question is about the original author of a piece of software's choice in licensing their software. How do you feel if that choice permits commercial, how can I say this, like
You mean
inclusion without...
proprietary modified versions?
Exactly.
Well,
For example, like the MIT license, I think, permits
you
it.
shouldn't call it the MIT license, it's the X11 license.
Okay.
MIT uses lots of licenses.
Okay.
But in any case, if the license permits the 4 freedoms, then it's not doing anything wrong. But I still think they could have done better if they had used a copyleft license, in most cases. Because once in a while, there's a case where there's a very good reason to use a permissive license like that one.
Could you give an example?
Well, I endorsed using the X11 license to release the software for playing OGG formats. And the reason is there is a very big and important battle between the use of the OGG formats for video and audio, which are formats that anybody's free to implement, versus the secret and the patented formats that most people use for releasing audio and video on the net. So we really need to do everything we can to encourage people to switch to distributing OGG formats, and that means we don't want to hold back proprietary players from supporting those OGG formats. Strategically, our freedom is more threatened if we copyleft, as it was the case in the past, the OGG player software. So I said I was in favor of releasing it under a permissive license.
Thank you.
I was wondering, could I ask 2 questions, maybe?
Okay.
All right. Thank you. The first one is you're talking about the ethical issue of programmers not releasing the source code to their works, their creative works, and
To their programs.
To their
because
programs, yes.
Most kinds of creative works don't have source code.
Granted. So I'm not sure if I agree with you that on its own is an ethical issue, and here's why. I think that if a person wants to keep their content or the
What do you mean by content? I don't know what you're talking about.
the inner workings behind their content, the content of the program, a secret, if they have the ingenuity to do so, I think it's well within their freedoms to try and do that the best way they
Well,
can.
I disagree with you. That's all I can say. Yeah.
Wouldn't you say that the more accurate, I guess, evil or ethical issue is the willingness of the consumer to be apathetic in simply being taken by these entrepreneurs as opposed to appealing to the free software community?
I'm sorry, I will not put all the blame on the foolishness of the victim and exonerate the perpetrator.
Yeah, okay. My second question is, there was an article on Slashdot a couple of weeks ago that I read about an Iowa school system that had recently adopted open source. Now, admittedly not the free software that you're talking about, but I'd say it's a step in the right direction. Similarly, there was an article in the BBC Press today about Scott McNeely, who's been asked to draft a letter to to Obama's administration about adopting open source software within the government. How do you think that the GNU project would best strategize to get itself further into the market? How do you see
Well,
them
we're not in a
marketing
market.
themselves in the future?
I mean, I'm not against markets, but what we're doing is not a market. We are engaged in a struggle for freedom, and there are markets in the free software community. Sometimes we sell things. Well, okay, we're selling to a market. When people paid me to make extensions in free programs, that was business, and I was in a market. But the free software community in general, it's a mistake to think of that as a market, because that puts it in an economic context, which is a misunderstanding. But anyway, when someone talks about, quote, adopting open source, unquote, it's not the same thing in practice as adopting free software would be, because it doesn't come with any principles. And there's never even the suggestion that a non-open source program is something bad that you should avoid. So what they mean is partly adopting some free programs, but they'll never even think about the idea that they should get rid of all the programs which are not open source, let alone get rid of all the programs which are not free, although those are actually pretty much, they're not identical, but they're pretty similar. But the point is, even if the free program is not even open source, they don't say that you should get rid of it, because the whole point of open source is not to raise it as an ethical issue. So it sounds similar. It looks, if you think that open source and free software are similar, if you think they're the same, that means you should be able to substitute one for the other. But when you take adopting open source and you substitute free software for open source, it's a big change in what we're proposing. Because what we propose includes the idea that a non-free program takes away your freedom and is unethical. So that means if you adopt free software, it means you've erased the non-free software. But that is not present even as a suggestion in the discourse of open source. So people can think and believe and say that they're adopting open source even as they know that they're using non-free programs which are not open source at the same time. So, I mean, maybe this will lead to some motion in the right direction, but we can't count on people to defend their freedom without even knowing what it is. So we still need to teach those people the idea of freedom and to value their freedom and defend it. They're not helping us do that.
So how would you say that we should do that?
Well,
I mean,
I'm doing it here.
what's the best
I don't
way?
know a better way. I mean, give speeches and publish articles.
Okay.
Those are the ways I know of. And I agree, it takes a lot of work. I wish those open source people were helping us instead, but we can't make them.
Okay. In terms of that issue, another thing might be, another way of countering open source may be to work really, really hard to create software that just blows the open source alternative out of the water.
Well, but the thing is, there's a bit of a misunderstanding there. Almost all open source programs are free programs.
Right.
We don't need to write replacements for them. Well, we're not going to write replacements for them just because of the political views of their authors if the program does qualify as free, and almost always it does. So no, we don't try to write replacements for those. There are plenty of proprietary programs that we need to write replacements for. So, you know, when a program such as OpenOffice is free, although the developers prefer to say open source, we don't criticize the program for that. We use it, and we're not working on a free software motivated free replacement for the free program OpenOffice. There's no need to reject the technical work just because the people who did it were not motivated by our motivation. But at the same time, it's a mistake to think that the motivations don't matter at all. Because when people think that non-free software is an injustice, they are going to be very strongly against introducing any, steering people towards it or whatever. But people who don't see any ethical issue there, then what is it we can depend on so that they won't steer it in a non-free direction? Well, we have much less to depend on. We're only depending on their ideas of what's technically advantageous. We're hoping that what they see as technically advantageous will turn out to also be respecting freedom.
Oh, right, I have a question. I'm writing a piece of software right now, my thesis, that heavily relies on community involvement. It's just strong dependence on every level of the project. In the future, I hope that people will, contribute to updating its source, but also...
Sounds good. What's the question?
It's sitting on top of a proprietary platform.
Well, that's a horrible mistake. What can you do to get it off of there?
I would have to work very hard.
Well, you have to work very hard. I'm sorry, but there's a mess that you made, and doing more work on this program is making the mess worse.
Does it help at all to sort of wean people away from proprietary software by introducing a sort of microcosmic, free-ish...
I don't understand what that means, but you said that your program only works on a proprietary platform, which means you're not leading people away from proprietary software, you're leading people to proprietary software.
Sorry?
GNU only, the GNU suite at first worked on proprietary platform.
Ah, well, yes, that's right. But there was a special thing going on there. We were developing a replacement for that proprietary platform.
So if I'm working towards a replacement for my proprietary platform, but I cannot deliver on that yet.
Well, the point is, the crucial thing is, what you're working on now is actually, it sounds like it's just an add-on, and you're not working at all on replacing the proprietary platform.
That's right.
Well, then I don't think you really can have that, I don't think you have that justification available to your project. Start working on replacing the proprietary platform, and then you'll have that justification available. As long as you're really working on it and not just an hour every month as a fake excuse. No, it's just...
I was wondering about your opinions on hardware in
Sorry,
relation...
you're wondering if what?
I was wondering about your opinions on hardware in relation to your ideas on free software, since many of...
You can't, there are no copiers for hardware and no source code, and you can't compile source code into a piece of hardware which you can then use, because we don't have anything that will make the hardware. So the issues are totally different. Now, there may be some areas where it's similar. I'm told in India, the cheapest way to get furniture is to go to somebody who builds it and say, make something like this. And so there, you really can copy furniture. So I guess there, freedom to copy furniture is an important issue. But for computer hardware, computer users don't have the means to copy or change it, so it's not an issue. I think this is an instance of trying to push an analogy where it's not useful.
I guess my thoughts are, at the very least, in theory you could, but more important...
I don't care about in theory. The question is it a real practical issue?
Yeah,
if something is only a problem in some theoretical sense, why criticize anybody about that?
Okay, that I understand, and on a more practical level, I guess I'm thinking that circuitry can very well have the same security issues that proprietary...
Circuitry can be malicious, but we can't, and that's a real problem. But we can't solve the problem the way free software solves it for software.
Well, I guess my thought is that if, say, schematics were available for circuitry, the community could look at the various open circuits and
maybe,
determine
except
malicious
maybe,
versus
except that
non-malicious.
how do you know the circuitry in the real device matches what they published, if you can't compile it yourself, and the other thing is, well, that's the main thing. I'm sorry, I don't want to extend things by analogy. I won't.
Okay, so I guess it's
These are
primarily
separate
a
questions that
practical
have to
issue.
be thought about separately, and then we'll see if we reach the same conclusions.
Okay, thank you.
I also have two questions, but they're sort of related. All right. So say every student is taught to write free software, and I have a programming assignment. Could I examine the source code of someone who's already done it, edit it, and then redistribute it to my instructor?
Well, I think that's just a question of what satisfies the class requirements. I mean, you'd be free you'd be free in general to get that, if someone wants to give you a copy of that free program, in general, yes, you'd be free to modify it and distribute it to people. It's just a question of whether that's considered an acceptable way to do your homework in your class.
Well, I'm assuming you would edit it in such a way that the original source was.
Well, that's a
not
different.
detected.
Again, that's just a question of what's an acceptable way to do homework in your class, which is a different question from whether you're free to do these things. I mean, you're free to look up answers to a test in you're free to look up all sorts of information in reference books, but you might have a test where you're told you're not supposed to do that.
Okay, I was thinking it was more analogous to plagiarizing an essay.
Well, it is somewhat like plagiarizing it. And so what I'm saying is free software doesn't, the free software political philosophy doesn't imply that you have to be allowed to plagiarize in class assignments, or actually to plagiarize anywhere, because plagiarism is lying. And in general, I'm not in favor of lying. When I say you should be free to modify a program and distribute the modified version, that doesn't mean lying about about the fact that somebody else wrote part of it.
All right, and that brings me to my second question, which is, aren't there domains such as some educational software, things that like check for plagiarism or security, where it's desirable that it be proprietary so that it's part of discovering
I don't think
vulnerabilities?
so. I think it's just wrong for things to be proprietary.
Yeah, I mean, like, what about things like encryption algorithms or something?
Encryption algorithms absolutely must be published.
Well,
Encryption experts will warn you very sternly not to trust any encryption algorithm whose source code has not been carefully studied, because that's likely to have horrible bugs that make it weak. The only way for society to convince itself that an encryption algorithm is not riddled with problems is to have a lot of people study it.
okay.
The security rests on the key, not on secrecy of the key, not secrecy of the algorithm.
Okay, so you believe everything should be free, including like the operating systems of fighter jets and all that?
Well, I'm not saying the Army should redistribute it to you.
Right.
But on the other hand, any Army that gets that software and doesn't have control over it is really fools.
Okay, so they wouldn't have to redistribute it. Okay, thank you.
For example, a government contractor selling you a fighter jet without including the software, the source code.
I can't hear you. What?
I'm sorry. An example of that would be
Speak
like,
slowly. I can't understand
Okay.
your words.
Okay. An example of that would be the government buying, say, a jet from Lockheed Martin and not having the source code included.
Exactly. And this is a real danger. About a year ago, Israel bombed Syria. And Syria's radar system mysteriously did not work. And there's a lot of speculation that there's a backdoor of some kind in that radar system, maybe when it detects a certain kind of signal that tells it to shut up and not report what it sees, and that the manufacturer, which was a French company, might have told Israel how to use this backdoor. And what I read was that the US is now worried that backdoors will be put into chips that are being made in China and then finding their way into US radars and weapons and so on. And, well, what can you do? It's a real issue, but you can't solve it with the free software solution, which is saying, well, when we find the problem, we'll all send around the fix and we'll recompile. You can't recompile the chip from its source code. If the problem is in software, you can fix it that way. If the problem is in hardware, you can't.
All right. The primary purpose of the copyleft clause, as I see it, maybe you disagree, is to restrict the freedoms of the immediate developer to the advantage of the users of the derivative works. As say, you restrict the freedom of the guy who releases a modified version to change the license in order to increase the freedom of users who might otherwise be given non-free software.
Except I wouldn't say it that way. It restricts the power of one user to protect the freedom of another. You see, it does restrict the users, but what does it stop them from doing? It stops them from exerting unjust power over others. And I don't think we should call that act freedom.
Well, why isn't that a freedom to change the license? The power...
Because it's power over others. Freedom is controlling your own life, and power is controlling other people's lives.
And it is the prerogative and freedom of those hypothetical users of the derivative product to use that particular non-free implementation as opposed to the original.
Oh, now you've changed what you're saying completely.
I don't think I
Now
have.
you're making a different fallacious argument, which is that people deserve the freedom to lose their freedom. And I think that's just twisting the word freedom in a semantic game.
Okay, so, but then you would agree that it is advantageous to restrict the power of that developer?
Yes, that's the intention, yes.
All right.
Specifically.
Okay.
Okay. When you first started, you talked about the 4 basic freedoms that qualify something as free software, and then you mentioned the DCMA taking
DMCA.
away DMCA. Okay.
Yeah.
DMCA taking away
Censoring software.
Censoring software. My question is, if a law could be passed, would you be in favor of requiring software that is, say, in the United States, to give those 4 basic freedoms? So passing a law that would require
I'm not
software.
advocating that now. Mm-hmm. And the reason is passing a law that many people would want to disobey is a bad thing. It makes a lot of people angry, and that's mainly what it does. I hope eventually people will learn to value and insist on their freedom, and that society will reject non-free software. But to advocate, to pass a law prohibiting non-free software while most people still want it is just asking for trouble.
I think that parallels the point that people want to share their software with their community. Right now
Yes.
we have laws that prohibit that, but the vast majority do want to share.
Yeah, exactly.
So, all right, thank you.
Now, I wouldn't object to laws liberalizing sharing, because that's a thing that lets the people do what most people want to do.
You briefly discussed terrorism just a little bit. And terrorism can be defined as using scary rhetoric or devices.
No, well, of course, tyrants can define anything they don't like as terrorism.
Well,
But usually, our definition of terrorism is not just a matter of warning people about dangers.
it's using fear in people to accomplish a goal.
No, actually, well, this kind of stretching the meaning of terrorism is exactly the sort of thing that the Bush regime did. And that's the way people can be convinced to give up their freedom. You tell them we need to stop terrorism, and then you stretch the definition of terrorism, and eventually you can prohibit whatever you like. I'm not going to go along with that.
I'm not saying that the Bush regime isn't terrorist in the way itself.
Well, it is, but that's a different question.
But if you are using rhetoric like attacking your freedoms, you are scaring people away from proprietary software. And while
I hope to be scaring them away. That's the intention.
Yes.
But it's for good reasons. I'm not exaggerating.
Okay, I don't disagree with you. Proprietary software isn't a good thing, but doesn't that kind of fall into the vague definition of terrorism?
No, you're being ridiculous. This kind of stretching the meaning of terrorism is something we must be on guard against all the time because it's standard practice as a way to attack our freedom. They pass laws supposedly against terrorism and then use them against protesters. I haven't thought about the question, right? Finding a good definition of an everyday concept is pretty hard. But that doesn't mean I can't recognize a very, very wrong definition when I see it. And telling people you think something is dangerous is not terrorism.
What are your views on projects where the data is important, such as Reddit open sourced the code for their website, but they didn't release the source?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
They didn't release...
Speak slowly.
Reddit, when they open sourced their website, they didn't...
I'm not in favor of open sourcing things, please. Well, go talk to somebody who's in favor of open source about that.
It's about the data that they didn't release with it, such as ranking of articles and such as that.
I don't know. I mean, seems like an unrelated issue to me.
All right, thanks.
I mean, if they're writing a program and running it, then it is free software in a trivial sense.
In addition to releasing software under a free license, does the developer also have an obligation to make their software as clear and easy to modify as possible?
No. I don't think that's the same kind of ethical issue. I mean, I think, of course, it's good to try to do good work rather than bad work. But I think we'd be making a big mistake to try to combine these two different kinds of issues.
Okay, thank you.
On the other hand, to obfuscate the source code means it's not the source code at all.
I have a comment on an earlier issue than a question. Earlier there was discussion about the use of hardware source code. There exist devices called programmable logic devices that are used even on some home routers that do have hardware source code, such as VHDL.
Sorry, what do you mean by why do you call it hardware source code? If I understand right what's going on in there, and I could be mistaken, I think we're talking about software. Well, if it's something you can load into the device, that is, you don't have to physically change it, that's software.
Right, and that is my point. So when you were talking about updating these chips and such, this can be implemented, so these chips are implemented in software.
Well, no, I would say the chip, the hardware, is the part that's the circuits. And that hardware is general purpose, and you load a specification of gates, I suppose, into it to tell it what to do. Well, the gate specification that you load, that's software. So this is really is analogous to loading a program into a computer, even though the chip is not a computer and what you load isn't a program. But or at least it's not an ordinary compiled program. It's a program compiled to run on a device that's not an ordinary computer. But I think the way we handle that kind of case is to recognize that that's a general purpose device and what you're loading is a program. It's software. And so the way to resolve the paradox is to recognize that the hardware isn't what you thought it was. Only part of it is hardware and part of it is software.
Okay, and I had a question concerning, I've seen some instances where a company will contribute to, say, the GNU Linux kernel.
Well, the kernel is Linux.
Right, okay.
The whole thing is GNU plus
so, okay,
Linux. The kernel is Linux.
So the Linux kernel, and it'll get licensed to some company, and it'll float around, bounce around, and eventually this third-party company modifies the kernel and puts it into, say, a proprietary home router, and does not release the source code.
Oh, well, if they do that, they're violating the GPL.
Right, but here's the question. Would you prefer that these companies did not contribute some of the source code and kept some of it proprietary versus not to contribute anything at all?
I don't give a damn what they contribute if what they're doing is not respecting people's freedom.
All right, thank you.
One, very quickly, excuse me. In the interest of spreading information about free software, will you record a sound clip for our radio station?
Sure.
Thank you. And you mentioned before working on a large project to help improve your programming ability. Do you have any other tips to achieve hackerdom? Excuse me.
No.
Thank you.
Hi. Without trying to kind of load in any opinion, I just want a clarification on the basic freedom. I know you've mentioned it a lot. Being able to distribute, redistribute exact copies for non-commercial use.
Could you ask a question?
Well, yes. I'm trying to just make sure I understand. So, given a situation where...
Think of peer-to-peer sharing.
Okay. Well, I understand.
You want to sharing music, sharing videos, sharing books, whatever. I mean...
Games?
Sure. Any published work, you should be free to share copies of in this way.
Okay. So, if person A develops a game and person B purchases it from them, and they supply the source code, it's free software, but they purchase it, and then person B distributes it to person C for free, that's acceptable. Exact
Of course.
copy. Okay.
I mean, if it's, well, first of all, we're mixing up two things, because two different questions. Because first you're talking about the minimum freedom, which is something I apply to art and entertainment, but not to software. Software should be free.
Okay.
Meaning the four freedoms in their complete glory. So if the game, or if part of the game is software, that should be free, and you specified in your scenario that it is free, which means it comes with the four freedoms, and the person who got a copy, however, is now free to not just non-commercially distribute exact copies, but can commercially distribute modified versions too. Okay. On the other hand, the game may also contain some artwork.
Well,
and that, I'm saying, it doesn't have to be free, so the artwork could be treated as artwork, and I think it's then legitimate to have only the minimum freedom. Well, but that would still permit somebody to non-commercially share over the net, because that's got to be, that freedom must never be infringed.
Okay, even if you were, well, I guess this is a different discussion altogether probably, but there is some argument within, say, the games community that a game itself could be considered art if it expresses an opinion.
Well, part of it is very likely to be art.
No, I'm not necessarily talking about just the visual art. I'm talking about the game as a whole experience, as a work of art.
I don't think I would agree to that, but it's a subtle question.
Yeah, well, okay. Thank you.
Hi. Wouldn't some ethical programs, such as antivirus software, be rendered rather obsolete if you distribute them as free software? Because
I don't think so, but then we don't have antivirus programs in the free software community for the most part.
Right, because you need root access to. make modifications. Well, I guess that's basically my question.
Actually,
So you
no, there
feel-
are free software antivirus programs, but I guess the viruses they're trying to detect are viruses for Windows.
Right. You don't see them on Linux. Well, new Linux.
Yeah.
Sorry. But thank you.
Some of this got covered in the last question from that side.
Well, then you can skip it, that part.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out how to explain this here. People would say under the system right now that people who innovate are rewarded because they can go and they can sell the software under a copyright. How would you defend the free software movement to people who say that it would stifle innovation because you could just release it freely?
Well, first of all, copyright is not the principal tool used to make software proprietary. The principal tools are contracts and not releasing the source code. And a third tool is TiVoization. And copyright they also use, but it's not the main thing. Okay. Second, I don't think innovation is desirable if it involves taking away our freedom. After all, democracy was at one point in innovation, and dictatorship was at one point in innovation. Innovations are not necessarily good. And it's a mistake to make innovation the only goal, which is a very common mistake in our society. In the political rhetoric of our society, people speak as if innovation were the one and only goal. Now, I'm more or less in favor of innovation, but that doesn't mean I would subordinate everything else to it. So if somebody says, here's an innovation that could be possible only if you give up your freedom, my response is not, well, then I guess I have to give up my freedom to get it. My response is, I'll live without it. And in fact, I've already decided that even if they do make those innovations in proprietary software, I won't accept it. That's how much I don't want those innovations at the price of my freedom. I won't even take them.
Right, I understand. But I guess my question is, right now, financially, a lot of people are motivated to innovate and to create software.
Again, if the innovation that comes at the cost of mistreating people is not a good thing at all. So I'd agree that the phenomenon you're talking about exists, but I don't think it's a good thing.
So you believe people would be intrinsically motivated to...
That's a different question. First of all, people aren't all the same. But remember, you just said two things that are different. First, you pointed out that some people are innovating because they're going to make proprietary software and they think that that will make them money. Well, I'm sure there are, right? But that doesn't mean it's good that they're doing so. I think it's bad that they're doing so because although one side effect of what they're doing may be innovation, the main effect is that they take away people's freedom from whoever is whoever can't resist that innovation. So I wish they didn't do it at all. And then you raised a different question, which is what other motives are there and how much will people innovate for other motives? Well, I don't actually know, but what I don't have to know for the arguments I'm making, because I'm saying I'd rather have whatever amount of innovation we'll have while we don't lose our freedom, and any more we might get by giving up our freedom, I don't want.
Okay, thank you.
Now, of course, working on free software is not synonymous with innovating. Sometimes free software involves an innovation, sometimes it doesn't. There are many motives for people to work on free software. Free software developers have many motives, including political idealism, having fun, learning, being admired, gratitude, and hatred for Microsoft, and money, because a lot of people are getting paid to do it. So I think, and of course, how much of this work is innovative, I can't begin to judge. I don't have any answer for that. But on the other hand, software development is often useful even when it's not innovative. Combining a lot of well-known ideas is often a very useful thing to do. So I think that there's the pattern of thought in our society is to focus too much on innovation in policy discussions. People focus on innovation to the point where they disregard other things that are at least as important and often more important. So that's the error we've got to be on the lookout for.
I think that covers everything. Thank you.
Well, it looks like we're done. Reminder, if you want to tell the FSF how to contact you, you can write it on here and give it back to me. You can join the FSF either in cash or by paying your membership through with a credit card online. We've still got some pins and key rings for sale and a few shirts.